does an NFL team create a competitive advantage around their travel strategies? I'm going to list out 4 of the top considerations that you can make as an NFL team when you approach domestic travel. Once again, we're talking domestic, not the international games, which take on a completely whole different set of rules. We'll go domestic. So the longest flight we could typically talk about within an NFL organization, sometimes you could get upwards of around that 6-hour time frame if I'm looking at a Miami to Seattle. So number 1 consideration, what is it? Time zone. What's the local time zone and what's your current time zone? Do you have to shift your circadian rhythm 1, 2, 3 hours within the United States? Well, if I'm traveling west to east versus east to west, that actually plays a difference in how I'm going to approach that travel. Physiologically, we know it's more difficult for our bodies to adjust when we travel from West Coast to the East Coast. So I'm going to approach that travel strategy and probably say, Coach, we need to come out here at least a day early. Many West Coast teams will do it where they travel on a typical Friday instead of a Saturday. They arrive in local time zone on the East Coast on a Friday evening, try to establish their circadian rhythm closer to that East Coast time zone. That's one strategy that you can make, and it's one of the most important. Now, when you travel back, you don't want to enhance that circadian rhythm because you do have to play maybe the next week on the West Coast. Number 2, our second most important strategy, what do you look at? Total time travel. So why does that matter? We know what happens on flights. Dehydration occurs. We go through this process where we get swelling and inflammation. When you're dealing with professional football players, they're already banged up. They're dealing with a lot of trauma, whether it's contact trauma or they're physically trying to rehab and return from an injury. We don't want to provide more inflammation. So how are you attacking that? Every 45 minutes, are you getting your players up, encouraging them to move around, develop more circulation? Are you using things that will help limit that inflammation? Are you using devices like a Normatec device that you can travel with on a plane and utilize sequential compression? Are you utilizing all of those tools that you have at your disposal? The third consideration as we look at this, what is the weather? How are you approaching a weather game? Is it a cold weather situation and you're traveling to Green Bay and it's 5 degrees? Is it a wet game? Are you traveling to Tampa Bay and there's going to be torrential downpours? If that's the case, how are you practicing throughout the week with wet ball drills and things like that so that your players can be ready? From an equipment standpoint, are you utilizing gloves? Well, if you're playing in a rain game, sometimes those gloves can be a hindrance and you might need to switch up your strategies. Are you practicing those things? And then from a heat and humidity standpoint, how are you hydrating and fueling your team going into a hot, humid environment? All of those factors play a significant role. Then number 4, what's the actual time of the kickoff? Is this a primetime game? If it is, what I like, because sometimes this can become an advantage, especially when we're talking about East Coast to West Coast teams, we're going to look at how we can properly fuel. A lot of times, NFL players sometimes get nervous. If you're playing that local time of a 1 o'clock kickoff, it's hard to get enough food and fuel into that athlete's body so that they can go out and optimize their performance for that day. That later kickoff actually allows us to get through full, complete meals, sometimes up to 3 of them in a day. The other thing you'll see from a tactical standpoint is many NFL coaches are going to sneak practice time through walkthrough reps within the ballroom of the hotel because they're on the road and they have the time. They can actually practice their plays and install and tweak things because that gives them a full additional day or at least a couple hours of preparation for that game. So these are 4 of the most important strategies to consider when you're traveling with an NFL organization and trying to find that competitive advantage to help your team win. Hit like, hit subscribe, stay tuned.